Everything seemed achingly ordinary, save for the haunting presence of bodies on the ground. One man staring blankly into space, his wrists bound in handcuffs, a blanket draped awkwardly around him, while an unsettling metallic smell lingered in the air. Blood, death. The scent was all too familiar by now, yet it never lost its power to unsettle, forever staining his senses with the deep distress of a world out of balance. It had been years since he felt a stir of sympathy for people caught in these harrowing circumstances. By now, he understood that when he was summoned to the scene of a crime, it usually meant that time was drawing to a close for anyone involved. Rarely was a man of his caliber called upon, but when he was, the resolution came swiftly. The agent, after meticulously surveying the scene for just a few moments, absorbed every detail before making his way to the suspect. This man, trembling before him, radiated fear, coldness, sorrow, and rage, a stark contrast to the typical demeanor one would expect from someone who had just taken a life, including that of his own dog. As the detective approached, the man's shaking intensified. "Who are you? Why are you here? Who called you? Are you a police off?" With his eyes wide with desperation, the man leapt up, trying to flee, but he was met with the solid presence of the detective, who forcefully pushed him back to the ground. "Sit down and shut up," the detective commanded, his voice firm and resolute, his expression a flash of anger that conveyed unmistakably not to test him. "What are you going to do to me?" The fear in his eyes mirrored that of prey just moments before the inevitable strike. He hadn't been asked a single thing yet, but like the officers who had come before him, he sensed the weight of danger in this man's presence. One crucial detail set him apart from the others. He knew precisely who this man worked for. It wasn't overt or glaring, an unnoticed detail to most. But having been part of the same organization, he recognized their insignia, a delicate white trillium flower stitched onto the collar of the agent's white undershirt spoke volumes. Instinctively, the moment he caught sight of it, his gut began to rot and his bowels almost released. The still of darkness was typical in this particular part of town, and would have remained unbroken if not for the disturbing call that drove police and paramedics into action that night. The cold rain, unwelcoming to most, brought a familiar, soothing comfort to this one detective. He stood tall, his body like a former athlete, brute and hard. His jaw, broad and heavy, was perfectly squared to such a precision that one might think it had been sculpted to his face. His deep-set eyes were shadowed between the ridge of his brow, and a nose that jutted out like an elbow on his face with a pair of square lenses rested on top. Cracked, taped, and thick, they sat on his face like an antique that had with him for years. His presence exuded intimidation, and it was clear none of the local officers were willing to make eye contact or talk to this detective, other than their sergeant who filled him in upon his arrival. Although they had never met, the sergeant knew who he was, not by badge or ID, but by the vehicle he arrived in. A model a year ahead of anything else on the streets, jet black with a matte finish. It boasted bulletproof windows and doors with a battering ram affixed to the front. The agent stood in silence as the sergeant gave him a briefing of the situation. "We've got a female victim, DOA, and a dog that apparently belongs to the suspect also shot. Other than the facts, nothing's adding up though. The guy's saying things that sound like he's either on something or suffering from severe mental health issues. Either way, we can't take his word for what's occurred, as it's absolute nonsense. He's claiming he can't remember how he got here, but that he came to meet our victim to get information about some place they both worked at." With those words, the agent began listening much more intently. "Go on." "Yeah, so he's saying they both worked at some." The sergeant instantly grew weary. He noticed how the mention of the place they apparently worked had sparked the detective's interest, and this gave the sergeant enough pause to stop and say, "You know what? You go talk to him, because I don't really remember what he said." Local officials, even at the level of the sergeant, knew their role, and when a member of this organization was on site, anything was possible, so it was probably best to back out and keep his name away from whatever was happening on this particular crime scene. The detective, realizing he wasn't going to get much from the local officers as they seemed to be treating the scene and suspect like characters from an episode of The Twilight Zone rather than a real investigation, he began searching the scene himself, gathering whatever evidence he could obtain before speaking to the suspect himself. He walked along the roadside, which stretched for miles in either direction, completely flat, inviting a long view that felt both vast and isolating. On a typical night, the gentle glow of the moon would have provided some light, along with the occasional passing car. However, tonight, the sky was a heavy blanket of overcast clouds, offering none of that, leaving only the harsh beacons of police vehicles and the flickering flashlights of a few officers to pierce the darkness. The agent turned on his own flashlight, illuminating the field to one side and the thick brush and forest to the other. He then approached the suspect, seized him gently by the arm, using a soft yet reassuring force to lift him back onto his feet. A flicker of comfort began to seep in, thanks to the agent's unhurried and gentle demeanor. Without uttering a single word, the agent simply nodded at the officers on the scene, escorting the suspect towards his vehicle.